Hello, I'm Wendy. Today I'm doing some watercolour sketchbook work painting spring blossom and talking about the pros and cons of using masking fluid when painting in watercolour. This is a painting I did a few years ago actually of spring blossom. I'm really not sure what the tree was. I think it was probably cherry. But the whole tree was actually covered in blossom. It was very early spring and there were no green leaves on it at all. It was just this mass of blossom. And it was white. It looked white on the photograph. There might have been little bits of pink in it. And there was the foliage underneath, which was yellow. It might have been some daffodils in there, I'm not sure. And then there was the distant trees. And I just found the whole scene very appealing. But particularly when you're painting in watercolour, all that white blossom on the tree is very difficult if you're not going to use things like white gouache on there or an opaque ink, because clearly you can't paint around very easily all that mass of blossom. I know you can do it, you can paint very loosely, and there are ways of interpreting this sort of scene without using masking fluid, clearly, but I think particularly when you're starting watercolour as well, that's quite a daunting challenge to paint like that. And you'll find that you can use masking fluid to great effect when you're painting scenes like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work in my sketchbook. I didn't want to particularly paint this all over again, and I'd lost the original reference. So I'm going to do another little painting. As I said, I'm going to do it in my sketchbook. It's not going to be a finished painting, but I'm hoping to show you the techniques that I used to produce that finished painting that I did a few years ago, and the techniques that I use all the time with the masking fluid. People do have a sort of love-hate relationship, I know, Marmite relationship if you like, with masking fluid, but it's worth persevering, and I'll show you some of the tips and tricks for using it as I go through the tutorial. Now I'm applying masking fluid here to the sketch that I did. The masking fluid that I'm using is PBO drawing gum, and I'll put a link to that in the description box below. You can see I've got some water there. I've got a little bit of washing up liquid in it, and I keep rinsing the brush out as I'm working in the washing up liquid. This protects the brush, and the brushes that I like to use are pretty good ones. You can buy masking fluid brushes as sets, and they are great. I tend to use some of my older brushes, which are a Sable synthetic mix watercolour brushes, or just the synthetic brushes. But you've got to have a nice brush. You've almost got to have it a brush that you would paint with. It's got to be something that you can get nice little marks with, and something that you're happy using that comes to a nice point, as you can see here. If you keep washing it out in soapy water, then you're not going to ruin it. You're not going to do it an awful lot of good, but on the other hand, you might as well not bother with masking fluid if you're not using a decent masking fluid and something decent to put the masking fluid on with. That's basically what I'm saying. So if you are struggling, then please take my advice. This masking fluid is a nice colour too, this PBO. It's a light bluey green, isn't it? And you can see it on your painting. Some are colourless, which I find very difficult to use, and some masking fluid is really bright colour, and I find that distracting if I'm painting. I hope you can see that some of the masking fluid I sort of put on in small blocks joined up together, if you like, particularly near the centre of the tree where the blossom was massed. But around the edges, then I spread the strokes out and put some little dots around the edges. And underneath, I masked out some areas to stand for maybe some daffodils or some foliage and flowers that were underneath there, and a few little dots and dashes there in the foreground to stand for fallen leaves. I give the brushes a good rinse in fresh warm water and washing up liquid at the end of the session to protect them. You want the masking fluid to be totally dry before you start putting on any of the background washes. I'm putting on here some Skywash and the first green of the trees behind. It got a little bit too wet, to be honest, so I was just manoeuvring the paper a bit there so it all sort of flowed together. The masking fluid shouldn't take that long to dry. This particular masking fluid, if it's put on correctly, will dry very quickly. You're only talking about 5 or 10 minutes. The very globby stuff, if you use that, that's never going to dry, so beware. Here I'm putting on some of the greens behind the tree, and as you can see I'm using a darker green behind the blossom, which is going to make it stand out. I'm doing this very quickly, putting these washes on. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail because it's more about using the masking fluid, but I'm hoping it's going to help you as well. I'm talking about some of the ways that I build up these pictures. I'm working the trees behind the bush wet into wet because I didn't want them to stand out too much. In the first picture that I showed you, I think I let those dry a little bit, and then as they were drying you can get harder edges and maybe put on a little bit of ivy on there, as much detail as you wanted really, but for the purposes of this I just kept everything very loose. I've rubbed off the masking fluid here, and this is where I come to the cons really, I suppose. I've been talking about the masking fluid as being really good to use, and it is, but there are some things against using it, and one of the main things is when you rub the masking fluid off, you are going to rub off some of those lines, or nearly all of those lines that you put on when you did your drawing. What I suggest you do is clearly not make a really detailed drawing because you know you're going to lose it. Press on as much as you can with the pencil when you're doing those branches and twigs, and maybe make a copy so that when you come to reinforce the drawing, as I've done here, then it will help you a little bit. I quite like the white spaces left underneath the tree, and I was planning to put some yellows on there. I wanted to put a little bit of foliage and grass there, so I was doing a little bit of dry brush here with a couple of greens, being careful not to go over all those nice spaces that I'd left for the flowers. I did a little bit of rigger work to suggest some of the grasses that were underneath there as well. The next stage was mixing up and applying a shadow colour to the blossom. I used, as you can see, a sort of bluey mauvey colour for this. You could get a colour from a tube or do a bit of mixing. What I suggest is to not distribute the paint too evenly. Have some areas with it sort of blocked in together, and then some of the areas, particularly on the outside, then spread the shadow colour out a little bit. If you're working from your own reference and from life, and you can see the shadows on it, then take your ideas from that. But if you're just having a go maybe at something like this in your sketchbook, then you're going to have to make it up as you go along. Here I'm filling in these spaces underneath the tree with some yellow and possibly a tiny bit of orange, and the marks could stand for daffodils. It is that time of year, and I think it looks quite nice. It's a nice contrast against the green. Now I have speeded this next bit up, painting the branches and the twigs on the tree because it does get very repetitive. You will also realise as I'm painting this that the tree structure, the trunks and the branches, don't bear an awful lot of relationship to my sketch, because as we said, you do lose the drawing that you put on when you rub off the masking fluid, unless maybe you instead of using a strong rubber, you could use your finger to take the masking fluid off. That might help. You want to, in this case, because it's branches and trees, you could press on with your pencil and it wouldn't matter. So I would suggest that you did that. You pressed on quite hard with your pencil and were a little bit careful maybe rubbing off the masking fluid. But you can't always press on with your pencil. There are certain areas in a painting you don't want heavy pencil marks. when you're using masking fluid. So again, that's one of the things against using the masking fluid. I put a little bit of extra shadow across the foreground area, and when that was dry I rubbed off those little bits of masking fluid that I'd put to stand for blossom that had fallen off the tree. I put a little bit of shadow on this blossom, as you can see here, just a touch, and then with a dark green paint anchored them to the ground, just with a few strokes, a little bit of shadow underneath them. As another tip here, I found if you want to make any adjustments to the effects that you've got with the masking fluid, you want to change anything, then a very opaque white like this one that I'm using here, you can just make some minor adjustments. Now I felt I hadn't intertwined the branches quite enough on this blossom, so I'm just putting, literally, you can see, just 1 or 2 marks in there that just made me feel a little bit happier. So there we are, there's some of the pros and cons of using masking fluid. I hope you found the video useful and will be able to use some of the tips and the techniques I've been talking about in your own paintings. As usual, if you don't want to miss anything that's coming up in the future on my channel, then do subscribe. Bye for now.